We started over 20 years ago in 1989 after our younger son had been taken into hospital suffering from asthma. It was his first bout of asthma, and he was quite seriously ill. He was taken into the Amiri Hospital and had excellent medical care. He's now in his early 30s, so it was a long time ago. But as soon as he started to feel better, he wanted to play. And the hospitals at that time were very bare and bleak and scary places. But we brought toys in from home, and very soon he was joined by other children on the ward, and suddenly it was the noise of children playing. It was a place where children felt that they should be. So when he was discharged, I asked if I could get some friends together, and we'd organise play activities for children in hospital and decorate the wards. So that's how we had our first experience of what being in hospital was like for children and their families. And we approached the Minister of Health for his permission to continue doing this, which he gave us very readily. But he said, don't ask us for any financial support. I said we didn't need that. We could provide that ourselves, or we'd ask for it from the community. But we asked for his help in bringing out experts from the UK and from the States. So over that first year, we had a number of people coming out from the UK who had experience of setting up organisations like the National Association for the Welfare of Children in Hospital in the UK. And one of the experts was a clinical psychologist who'd worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was probably the pioneer of the hospice movement in the States in the 1960s. And he'd worked particularly with children who were dying, and suggested that he gave a lecture on children's perceptions of death and dying, because this was some time ago, over 20 years, and even in Europe, little was said about dying, even for adults, and to talk about children dying was almost a taboo subject. However, we advertised it in the local press, and we had a huge response to it. In the audience was a young mother. She was manakaba, she was covered, which was very unusual in Kuwait at that time. When she spoke, she had beautiful English, she was very articulate, and a very powerful advocate for her son, who had been diagnosed with neuroblastoma, a childhood cancer, and had gone to the UK for treatment. He spent several years in the UK, had remission and then relapsed, and finally the doctors said that she should come back to Kuwait to have the support of her family, because he would probably not survive for much longer than a few months. So this young woman asked very pertinent questions about her son and what he would likely understand about what was happening to him. And afterwards she came up to Dr. Hilal and myself and asked how we as an organisation, we just started CATCH, Kuwait Association for the Care of Children in Hospital, how we could help her support her son at home. She'd made a promise to him that he would never have to go into hospital again, and how could we help her keep that promise? And so in 1989, Hilal got together a group of the most important person, a paediatric oncologist who had been trained in the States at Envy Anderson Hospital, and so knew how to manage a child's pain. He was an expert in managing children's pain, and particularly pain related to cancer. And so over the next 7 to 8 months, this little boy, his name was Abdullah, had his pain managed. We contacted Great Ormond Street Hospital in London and brought out a couple of nurses who were on their symptom support team, an outreach program for children who were terminally ill. And they were able to work with Abdullah's mother and help her look after her little boy at home. And over that length of time, Abdullah got to know our sons very well, our children. And one afternoon he was playing with them, and then as the evening approached, he came to say goodbye, and he hugged each one of us and then asked if Khalid, our older son, who was about 10 or 11 at that time, if he could go home with him to read him a bedtime story. So Khalid went, read him a bedtime story, came back again, and at 2 o'clock the next morning, Abdullah passed away in his mother's arms and free of pain with the immediate family around him. This was a very powerful experience for us. And Abdullah died in April of 1990. Shortly after that, we left, as many of the Kuwaitis do, at the beginning of the school holidays. We went to our home in Scotland for the summer, and then there was the invasion of Kuwait on August the 2nd. So it was a couple of years before I came back to Kuwait, and my husband was dean of the medical school. He came back and restarted the medical school. And then another 2 years before we restarted CATCH, our association. And then, because of the depression within Kuwait, we concentrated on developing the support that we had started with our volunteers, but recognizing that we had to develop a profession that we'd come to know as child life in the States, child life specialists. And we started a course at Kuwait University, a 1-year postgrad course in child life to graduate our own child life specialists, and we were able to extend our program into other hospitals in Kuwait. And with our experience in that program, the child life specialists give psychosocial support to children and their families. So through play, which is the language of children, they help children understand why they're in hospital, what is happening to them. They prepare them for treatments, such as MRIs. They have a little tent with a trolley that goes that can be pulled in and out, and they have the recording of the sound of an MRI machine. I don't know if you've ever had an MRI, but it makes a loud clunking sound, and when you're within the small tunnel of the MRI machine, it can be frightening. I've had 2 hip replacements, I've had many MRI, and I hate them, I'm terrified. So for a child, many of them are sedated or actually anaesthetized in order to be able to go into the machine and stay still. But research in Scotland has shown that over 70% of children who are prepared by child life specialists in this way, they experience the sound and going into a smaller confined space, that 70% of children are able to do that without being anaesthetized. And we found that they were very much more prepared and able to keep still when we prepared them in that way. And just blowing bubbles when they're having an injection or something like this to help distract them. So child life was what we continue to develop. But our work with our child life specialists in hospitals where children had cancer and were dying, in particular, demonstrated that it wasn't always as it was for Abdullah, that children's pain wasn't always recognized, it wasn't managed, and very often children were sedated rather than have their pain managed. We'd experienced how Abdullah could play. And the reason I tell the story of our experience on the day that Abdullah died is to demonstrate how normal in his relations he could be, how he wanted to do what other children do. And that's the experience that stayed with us. So we let people know that we wanted to build a children's hospice in Kuwait, because we knew from our experience with international organizations that a hospice is a place where special care is given, palliative care for adults, pediatric palliative care for children, because children are different from adults, and their emotional, their developmental, their physical responses to drugs are different from adults, and they need the specialist care of trained children's doctors, pediatricians. So our ambition was to build a pediatric children's hospice. And one day, I must try to pinpoint the exact day sometime, it's about 7 years ago, I had a phone call from a young student at Kuwait University. She was an architectural student, and she was trying to decide on what she should do for her final thesis. And she'd heard from one of her supervisors that we wanted to build a children's hospice, and so she phoned up and asked for a meeting and asked, what is a children's hospice? So then it started a long dialogue, her research into children's hospices worldwide. We talked about the needs of children and their families and the special needs of children and families in this particular situation of a child dying. We talked about the obstacles that might be there from the community, from people who would perhaps not want to be associated with a place where they might think this is where children go to die. And this young girl, Alia Al-Ghanem, went away, did her research, and came back with this incredible design for a children's hospice. She said you wanted it to be a place where children would be happy to go to, would want to go to. And so she made the whole building interactive. The building itself is like a toy. Part of palliative care is to give respite, to give the family a rest, just a short break, a little holiday from the stress of looking after a child, very seriously ill child at home. And so she provided these chalets that you can see behind you. The chalets are where Kuwaitis, they have them by the seaside, all along the coast of Kuwait. And this is where they go for their weekend breaks or for the Eid holidays to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. And so the chalets were there for the families to come for a short holiday with the support of all of the hospital staff. So we had the design, very unusual design. It was hard for me to take in because it didn't relate in the physical way to any of the hospices I had seen. But it certainly related very directly to the needs of the children and the families. And so with our experience in the hospitals here in Kuwait, we realized that we had this beautiful design, but we had to raise awareness of the need to have a specific facility for looking after children with terminal conditions. Why couldn't they be just looked after in the general hospital wards or in any of the children's pediatric wards here in Kuwait or anywhere else? And really the answer to that is that doctors are taught, they're trained, and they're trained very well to cure patients. And psychologically, it may be completely unconsciously, they find it very difficult to continue that intimate and very close relationship with a child and family when they know their treatment has failed. Quite naturally, they can feel that perhaps they themselves had failed, and they find it difficult to continue to have that close relationship with the families, and families can therefore often feel abandoned. I'm talking generally here. There are always exceptions to that. But generally this is what occurs. Plus, if the child is in a hospital setting where other children are getting better, it can be very difficult for them and for their families to see the child in the room next door get better. So a better situation is where the child comes and their clinical support is continued, not just continued, but is managed to their needs. So whereas they may stop curative treatment in terms that they may stop their chemotherapy and their radiotherapy and other medications because of the side effects and because they're not working, they may still continue with some chemotherapy for palliation, to reduce the size of the tumour, to make the child more comfortable. So the treatment continues, but it has a different direction, and the direction is for the comfort of the child, to make the child as comfortable as possible without shortening the child's life. There is sometimes a misconception that palliative care it does not, and can often prolong not only the quality of life but also the length of the child's life. So it's a very specialised, complex clinical subspecialty now. It has been recognised in its own as a subspecialty. And that required experts to come and demonstrate, to lecture, to mentor, to show our doctors here how this particular medicine can work for children, how this treatment can work for children and for their families. And of course, paediatric palliative care involves the whole family. A child is part of a family unit, and everybody in that family is affected by a child going through this particular journey.